Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, a secret document lay hidden in the Queen's private study for decades. When the royal seal was finally broken after her passing, the contents would ignite the most explosive family feud the British monarchy had seen in generations. Lady Louise Windsor, the quiet granddaughter who had always lived in the shadows of her famous cousins, suddenly found herself at the center of an inheritance battle that would expose the raw ambitions, bitter jealousies, and carefully guarded secrets of the royal family. What the Queen had decided in her final years would not only shock the world, but turn family members against each other in ways that would make the palace walls echo with arguments that hadn't been heard since the days of Henry VIII. The estate in question wasn't just any property, it was Balmoral's most private section, worth over £200 million, complete with its own hunting grounds, historic castle ruins, and the Queen's personal collection of priceless artifacts. But more than money was at stake. This inheritance represented something far deeper: the Queen's final judgment on who truly understood the meaning of duty, service, and the future of the monarchy. As news of the inheritance spread through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, one question burned in everyone's mind. How could a 20-year-old university student who had barely given a public speech inherit what many believed rightfully belonged to the future Queen Consort's family? The answer would reveal a story of quiet observation, secret conversations, and a grandmother's final act of defiance that would change the royal family forever. The morning mist hung heavy over Balmoral Castle as Lady Louise Windsor stepped out of the black Bentley, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the official envelope that had arrived at her Edinburgh University dormitory just 3 days earlier. The 20-year-old had been studying for her English literature exams when the palace courier appeared at her door, carrying news that would change everything she thought she knew about her place in the royal family. Louise had always been the forgotten granddaughter. While her cousins William and Harry dominated headlines and her younger brother James received attention as the new Earl of Wessex, she had cultivated a reputation for being almost invisible at royal events. She preferred her horses to photographers, chose university life over royal duties, and had deliberately avoided the spotlight that seemed to consume other members of her generation. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, had raised her with the understanding that she would likely live a relatively normal life, working a regular job and staying on the periphery of royal obligations. But standing before the imposing Scottish castle that had been her grandmother's most beloved retreat, Louise realized that her late majesty had been watching more carefully than anyone had imagined. The envelope contained not just a formal letter from the royal solicitors, but something far more personal, a handwritten note from the Queen herself, written in the distinctive blue ink she had used for personal correspondence throughout her 70-year reign. The letter was brief but profound. "My dear Louise, you have shown me what it means to serve without seeking recognition. The Craigievar section of Balmoral, with all its contents and responsibilities, now belongs to you. Use it wisely, and remember that true nobility lies not in titles, but in character. Your loving grandmother, Elizabeth R." Louise had read those words 100 times during the train journey from Edinburgh to Scotland, each reading making the reality seem more surreal. The Craigievar section wasn't just any part of the Balmoral estate. It was the Queen's most private sanctuary, a 1,500-acre stretch of highland wilderness that included a restored 16th-century tower house, private gardens that the Queen had designed herself, and a collection of personal artifacts that had never been displayed publicly. More importantly, it was where the Queen had retreated when she needed to escape the pressures of monarchy, where she had written her most personal thoughts, and where she had made some of the most crucial decisions of her reign. The inheritance had sent shockwaves through the royal household before Louise even knew about it. Palace staff whispered in corridors about the unprecedented nature of the bequest. Never in the history of the monarchy had such a significant private estate been left to someone so far from the direct line of succession. Protocol dictated that major royal properties should remain within the immediate line of inheritance, typically passing to the heir apparent or being absorbed into the crown estate for future generations. But the Queen had structured this inheritance in a way that made it legally unassailable. Years before her death, she had quietly transferred the Craigievar section into a private trust, removing it from the crown estate and making it her personal property to dispose of as she wished. The paperwork had been handled discreetly by a small firm of Edinburgh solicitors who specialized in Highland estate law, far from the scrutiny of the royal legal team who managed most palace business. The news had reached other family members through a carefully worded statement from the Queen's private secretary, delivered to senior royals just hours before Louise received her personal letter. The timing was deliberate. The Queen had wanted Louise to hear about her inheritance from the source, not through family gossip or media speculation. At Clarence's house, the reaction had been swift and intense. Camilla, now Queen Consort, had been entertaining her son Tom Parker Bowles and daughter Laura Lopes when the palace secretary arrived. The three had been discussing renovation plans for Rainmill House, Camilla's private country estate, when the official notification interrupted their conversation. Tom Parker Bowles, a successful food writer who had always maintained a respectful distance from royal affairs, found himself unusually vocal about the inheritance. "It's not about the money," he had told his mother and sister as they sat in stunned silence. "It's about what this means for the family hierarchy. Louise has done nothing to earn this level of recognition. She's barely even a working royal." Laura Lopes, typically more diplomatic than her brother, had focused on the practical implications. "Mother, this sets a dangerous precedent. If the Queen could bypass established family members for someone like Louise, what does that say about the stability of royal inheritance? Your grandchildren will grow up thinking they have no predictable place in this family." But it was Camilla's reaction that would prove most significant. The Queen Consort had spent decades carefully building her position within the royal family, overcoming public skepticism and establishing herself as a trusted partner to King Charles. The idea that the late Queen had made such a substantial bequest without consulting the current monarch or his wife felt like a personal slight that went beyond mere property transfer. "This is about more than an estate," Camilla had said quietly, her voice carrying the steel that had helped her survive decades of public scrutiny. "This is about Elizabeth's final judgment on our family's future. She's sending a message about who she believed represented the best of royal values. And that message doesn't include us." The immediate practical implications were staggering. The Craigiever estate generated substantial income through its organic farming operations, rare whiskey distillery, and exclusive hunting rights that were leased to wealthy international clients. The annual revenue exceeded £2 million, making Louise financially independent in a way that most minor royals could never achieve. More significantly, the estate included the Queen's private study, which contained personal papers, photographs, and memorabilia that historians would consider invaluable. Louise had spent her first night at Craigiever, walking through rooms that felt like a museum of her grandmother's private life. The Queen's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it during her final summer at Balmoral, with reading glasses still folded on the bedside table next to a biography of Queen Victoria. The private sitting room contained hundreds of family photographs spanning 8 decades, including many that Louise had never seen before. Candid shots of royal children playing, informal portraits of state visits, and personal moments that revealed the human side of the monarchy. But perhaps most overwhelming was the Queen's study, a circular room at the top of the Tower House that overlooked the Highland Peaks. The walls were lined with leather-bound journals dating back to the 1950s, each one containing the Queen's private thoughts about major events, family developments, and personal reflections on the challenges of monarchy. A mahogany desk held correspondence files organized by decade, including letters from world leaders, family members, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the royal family. Louise had spent hours reading through documents that painted a picture of her grandmother she had never fully understood. The Queen had been acutely aware of every family dynamic, every personality conflict, and every instance of genuine service versus self-promotion. Her observations about various family members were frank and sometimes surprising, revealing a woman who had watched her extended family with the careful attention of someone who understood that the monarchy's survival depended on choosing the right people to carry it forward. One journal entry, dated just 6 months before the Queen's death, had particularly struck Louise. "I have watched Louise grow into young womanhood with genuine admiration. While others seek the spotlight, she seeks understanding. While others demand recognition, she offers service. She reminds me of myself at that age, uncertain about her path, but committed to doing what is right rather than what is easy." The monarchy will need people like Louise in the years ahead, individuals who understand that true leadership comes from character, not ambition. The weight of such expectations felt crushing to a young woman who had never imagined herself playing a significant role in royal affairs. Louise had planned to finish university, perhaps pursue graduate studies, and eventually find work in the arts or education sector. The idea of managing a major Highland estate while carrying the responsibility of her grandmother's legacy seemed impossibly daunting. Yet as she stood in the Queen's study, surrounded by decades of wisdom and experience, Louise began to understand that this inheritance wasn't just about property or money, it was about trust. Her grandmother had entrusted her with something precious, the responsibility to preserve and protect a vision of what the monarchy could be at its best. The estate would serve as a living reminder of values that transcended titles and hierarchy, a place where character mattered more than position in the line of succession. The first phone call had come from her father, Prince Edward, whose voice carried a mixture of pride and concern. "Louise, darling, this is extraordinary, but you need to understand the implications. The family is in turmoil, and there will be immense pressure on you to either share this inheritance or transfer it to someone they consider more appropriate. You'll need to be stronger than you've ever been." Her mother, Sophie, had been more direct. "The Queen chose you for reasons that others don't understand yet, but they will try to make you doubt that choice. Remember that your grandmother was the wisest woman I ever knew, and she didn't make this decision lightly." As the sun set over the Highland Mountains, casting long shadows across the estate that was now her responsibility, Louise realized that her quiet life was ending. The inheritance had made her a player in royal politics whether she wanted to be or not, and the reactions from Camilla's family were just the beginning of what promised to be a complex and challenging battle for the soul of the monarchy's future. The Queen's final gift to her granddaughter was not just land and money. It was a test of whether Louise possessed the strength and wisdom to stand up for principles that had guided the monarchy for centuries, even when doing so meant facing opposition from the very family she had always tried to avoid disappointing. The emergency family meeting at Clarence House 3 days after the inheritance announcement revealed fault lines in the royal family that had been carefully hidden from public view for years. King Charles sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, his face bearing the exhaustion of a man who had inherited both a crown and a family crisis simultaneously. To his right, Queen Camilla maintained her composed exterior, while her children flanked her on either side, their expressions mixing barely contained anger with calculated determination. Tom Parker Bowles had abandoned his usual diplomatic approach to royal matters. As a food critic and cookbook author, he had built his career on remaining separate from royal controversies. But the Craigivar inheritance had shattered his carefully maintained neutrality. "Your Majesty," he addressed his stepfather with formal courtesy that barely masked his frustration. "This inheritance represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how royal succession should work. Louise is 20th in line to the throne, barely participates in royal duties, and has shown no interest in taking on major responsibilities. How can she suddenly inherit something that rightfully belongs to the immediate royal family?" Laura Lopez nodded emphatically, her aristocratic composure cracking slightly as she leaned forward in her chair. "The precedent this sets is dangerous beyond measure. My children, your step-grandchildren, will grow up believing that merit and service don't matter in this family, that random favoritism determines inheritance. What kind of message does that send about the stability of the monarchy?" King Charles found himself in an impossible position. As the new monarch, he needed to maintain family unity while respecting his mother's final wishes, even when those wishes seemed designed to create maximum disruption. "The Queen's decision was made with her complete mental faculties intact," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades learning to balance family loyalty with institutional responsibility. "The legal documents are ironclad, and challenging them would create exactly the kind of public spectacle that would damage the monarchy far more than accepting this inheritance." Camilla's response was measured but pointed. "Charles, this isn't about legal challenges or public spectacle. This is about family respect and appropriate hierarchy. Your mother spent her final years making decisions that seemed specifically designed to elevate people who had done nothing to earn their position, while ignoring those who had sacrificed for this institution." Her voice carried decades of accumulated frustration about her position in the royal family, carefully modulated but unmistakably bitter. The Queen Consort had spent years proving herself worthy of royal acceptance, enduring public criticism and media scrutiny while supporting Charles through his most difficult period. The idea that Louise, who had contributed virtually nothing to royal duties, could receive such a significant inheritance felt like a fundamental rejection of Camilla's efforts to establish legitimacy within the family structure. "My children have shown nothing but respect for this institution," Camilla continued, her composure beginning to fracture slightly. "They've maintained appropriate distance when asked, supported you unconditionally, and never sought to profit from their connection to the monarchy. Yet they're bypassed in favor of someone whose greatest achievement is remaining invisible at state occasions." Prince William, who had remained silent during the initial exchanges, finally spoke with the authority of someone who understood that his own future reign would be affected by how this crisis was resolved. "The deeper issue here isn't Louise or even the specific inheritance. It's that we're discovering grandmother made major decisions without consulting anyone, decisions that affect family dynamics for generations. If she could transfer Craigivar without discussion, what other surprises might we encounter as we sort through her estate?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Royal inheritance had traditionally been predictable, following established patterns that ensured stability and continuity. The Queen's unilateral decision to gift such a substantial estate to a minor royal suggested either a breakdown in family communication or a deliberate strategy to reshape royal priorities that no one had anticipated. Princess Anne, characteristically direct, cut through the diplomatic language with uncomfortable clarity. The problem isn't that Louise inherited something valuable. The problem is that none of us understood what Mother was thinking during her final years, and now we're learning that her assessment of family merit was very different from our assumptions. She looked pointedly at Camilla and her children. Perhaps the question isn't why Louise received this inheritance, but why others didn't. The comment landed like a physical blow. Tom Parker Bowles straightened in his chair, his professional composure finally cracking completely. With all due respect, Your Royal Highness, that's exactly the kind of attitude that makes this inheritance so problematic. The suggestion that my family somehow failed to meet the Queen's standards is both unfair and destructive. We've done everything asked of us while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Laura Lopez was more emotional in her response. My mother gave up her entire life to support this family, endured decades of public attacks, and helped King Charles through his darkest period. The idea that she somehow failed some secret test that Louise passed is insulting beyond measure. King Charles raised his hand to stop the escalating argument, but the damage was already done. The inheritance had exposed resentments and assumptions that had been carefully buried for years, creating divisions that would be difficult to heal, even with time and effort. Meanwhile, at Craigivar, Louise was discovering the practical complexities of her inheritance in ways that no family meeting could have prepared her for. The estate employed 47 people full-time, from gamekeepers and farm workers to house staff and groundskeepers. Each employee had worked for the Queen personally, developing relationships that went beyond mere employment to something approaching family loyalty. Mrs. Margaret MacDonald, the estate manager who had served the Queen for 32 years, had become Louise's unofficial guide to understanding both the property and the expectations that came with it. Your grandmother didn't just give you land, Lady Louise, she explained as they walked through the organic vegetable gardens that supplied the castle's kitchen. She gave you responsibility for an entire community that depends on this estate for their livelihoods and their identity. The financial realities were staggering. The estate's annual operating budget exceeded £1.8 million, covering everything from staff salaries and equipment maintenance to conservation projects and infrastructure improvements. The income streams were diverse but required careful management. The organic farm produced specialty crops for high-end restaurants, the whiskey distillery created limited-edition bottles that sold for premium prices, and the exclusive hunting rights generated substantial revenue from wealthy international clients who paid enormous fees for the privilege of stalking Highland deer in the Queen's private preserve. But beyond the financial complexities lay deeper responsibilities that Louise was only beginning to understand. The Queen had used Craigivar as a testing ground for conservation initiatives that were later implemented across other royal estates. The property served as a refuge for endangered Highland wildlife, a research center for sustainable farming practices, and a model for how traditional estates could balance historical preservation with environmental protection. Louise discovered detailed files outlining the Queen's vision for the estate's future, including plans for expanded renewable energy projects, wildlife corridors connecting to neighboring properties, and educational programs that would allow university students to study conservation techniques in a real-world setting. The Queen had imagined Craigivar as a living laboratory for sustainable land management, a place where traditional Highland culture could coexist with modern environmental science. The weight of such expectations would have been overwhelming for anyone, but for a 20-year-old university student who had never managed anything more complex than her own study schedule, it felt impossible. Louise found herself questioning not just her ability to fulfill her grandmother's vision, but her right to try. The first direct confrontation came through an unexpected phone call from Tom Parker Bowles, who had obtained Louise's mobile number through palace contacts and called her directly rather than working through official channels. His voice carried the polished authority of someone accustomed to conducting business at the highest levels. "Louise, I think we need to discuss this inheritance situation frankly," he said without preamble. "You're a bright young woman, but you must realize that accepting this estate puts you in an impossible position. You don't have the experience to manage something this complex, and you certainly don't have the family support necessary to succeed." Louise had been expecting such a call, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "Tom, I understand this is complicated for everyone, but the Queen made her decision for reasons I'm still trying to understand. I'm not going to abandon her wishes just because they're inconvenient." "This isn't about convenience," Tom replied, his tone shifting to something more paternalistic. This is about reality. Managing Kregavar requires connections you don't have, expertise you haven't developed, and political sophistication you've never needed. The responsible thing would be to transfer this inheritance to family members who can actually handle it properly. The suggestion that she was inherently incapable of managing her inheritance because of her age and inexperience struck Louise as both condescending and revealing. Are you suggesting I should give up my inheritance because I'm not qualified, or because your family feels entitled to it instead? The directness of the question clearly caught Tom off guard. I'm suggesting that you should consider what's best for the monarchy as a whole, rather than clinging to something you can't handle out of personal pride. Louise's response surprised even herself with its firmness. What's best for the monarchy is honoring the wisdom of the woman who led it successfully for 70 years. If the Queen believed I could handle this responsibility, then perhaps the question isn't whether I'm qualified, but whether I'm willing to become qualified. The conversation ended shortly after, but its implications resonated far beyond the immediate exchange. Louise realized that the family pressure would only intensify as the practical complexities of the inheritance became apparent, and that she would need allies if she hoped to fulfill her grandmother's expectations while maintaining family relationships. The Queen's private papers revealed that she had anticipated exactly this scenario. A sealed letter, addressed to Louise personally, dated just 1 month before the Queen's death, contained advice that seemed almost prophetic. My dear girl, by the time you read this, you will have discovered that doing what is right is rarely the same as doing what is easy or popular. The inheritance I am giving you will test not just your abilities but your character. Remember that I chose you not because you were ready, but because I believed you could become ready. Trust yourself, but more importantly, trust the principles that have guided this family through 8 centuries of challenges. As Louise prepared for what she knew would be increasingly difficult conversations with family members who felt wronged by the Queen's decision, she began to understand that her grandmother's final gift was not just an estate, it was an education in the kind of leadership that the monarchy would need to survive the challenges of the 21st century. The media storm that erupted 2 weeks after the inheritance became public transformed Louise from an unknown royal into the most scrutinized young woman in Britain overnight. The story had initially leaked through palace staff who couldn't resist sharing gossip about the unprecedented inheritance with friends and family members. By the time the official palace statement was released, confirming that Lady Louise Windsor had indeed inherited a substantial portion of the Balmoral estate, the British press was already in full investigative mode. The headlines were sensational and polarizing. The forgotten granddaughter's fortune, royal inheritance shocker, Louise gets the prize, and most damagingly, why did the Queen snub Camilla's children? The coverage revealed uncomfortable truths about public perceptions of various royal family members, with many commentators openly questioning why Louise deserved such recognition, while others who had served the crown more visibly received nothing. Louise discovered the harsh realities of media attention when photographers began camping outside her Edinburgh University residence, following her to lectures and attempting to photograph her during private moments with friends. The contrast with her previous anonymity was jarring and overwhelming. Students who had barely acknowledged her existence suddenly wanted to befriend her, while others whispered behind her back about favoritism and unearned privilege. The most painful coverage came from royal correspondents who had covered her grandmother for decades and felt qualified to judge the Queen's final decisions. Richard Palmer, a veteran royal reporter for The Express, wrote a particularly stinging analysis that questioned whether Louise possessed the maturity and experience necessary to manage such a significant inheritance responsibly. While Lady Louise Windsor may be a pleasant young woman with good intentions, nothing in her background suggests she has the capability to manage a complex estate worth hundreds of millions of pounds, Palmer wrote. The Queen's decision, while legally unassailable, raises serious questions about whether personal affection clouded institutional judgment. The monarchy cannot afford to be seen as favoring unprepared family members over those who have demonstrated genuine commitment to royal service. Such criticism stung precisely because Louise secretly agreed with much of it. She had never sought responsibility, had deliberately avoided the spotlight, and genuinely questioned her ability to manage an inheritance that seemed designed for someone with decades more experience. The self-doubt that had always been part of her personality now felt overwhelming under the glare of national attention. But the criticism also revealed something unexpected: public support from quarters Louise had never anticipated. Letters began arriving at Kregavar from ordinary citizens who saw her inheritance as a refreshing departure from royal predictability. Many writers expressed admiration for the Queen's decision to reward quiet service over self-promotion, viewing Louise as a symbol of authentic royal values in an era of celebrity culture. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, a retired teacher from Yorkshire, wrote a letter that particularly moved Louise. Your grandmother watched you grow up with the kind of attention that only someone who truly understood character could provide. She saw in you what the rest of us hope to see in our own children. Someone who does what's right without expecting recognition. Don't let the critics convince you that you're unworthy of this trust. The support from unexpected sources gave Louise strength to face what proved to be the most difficult confrontation yet, a visit from Queen Camilla herself. The Queen Consort arrived at Credivar on a gray October morning, officially to pay her respects at the place where the late Queen had spent her final summer, but actually to have the conversation that both women knew was inevitable. Camilla's approach was more sophisticated than her children's direct confrontation. She toured the estate with genuine interest, asking informed questions about the Queen's conservation projects and commenting knowledgeably about Highland farming practices. Her decades of experience in aristocratic circles had taught her to appreciate the complexities of managing large country estates, and she could see immediately why the Credivar inheritance was so valuable, both financially and symbolically. Your grandmother created something remarkable here, Camilla said as they walked through the walled garden that the Queen had designed personally. This isn't just a retreat. It's a working model of how traditional estates can contribute positively to contemporary society. I can understand why she wanted to preserve that vision. Louise appreciated the diplomatic opening but sensed the more difficult conversation ahead. I'm still learning about everything she accomplished here. Some days it feels overwhelming to think about continuing her work. Camilla's response was carefully calibrated. Louise, I hope you know that my concerns about this inheritance aren't personal. I've watched you grow up, and I've always thought you were a lovely young woman with excellent instincts. But I'm worried that you're being set up for failure by people who should be protecting you from unreasonable expectations. The suggestion that Louise was somehow being manipulated rather than honored struck a nerve. I don't think my grandmother would have given me something she believed would hurt me. If anything, she seems to have prepared for this decision for years. Preparation and success are different things, Camilla replied gently. Managing Credivar requires connections in Scottish society, relationships with government officials, and experience with conservation organizations that take decades to develop. Without that foundation, even the best intentions can lead to costly mistakes. Louise realized that Camilla was offering what she genuinely believed was helpful advice, but the subtext was clear. Louise should recognize her limitations and transfer the inheritance to people better equipped to handle it. The conversation felt like a test of whether she possessed the strength to resist pressure that would only increase with time. What are you suggesting I should do? Louise asked directly. Camilla's response revealed the careful thought that had gone into this conversation. I think you should consider creating a family trust that would allow you to maintain nominal ownership while bringing in experienced family members to handle day-to-day management. That way you honor your grandmother's wishes while ensuring that Credivar receives the professional oversight it deserves. The proposal was elegant in its reasonableness. Louise would keep the inheritance technically while ceding actual control to people who Camilla implied were better qualified. It was a face-saving solution that would resolve family tensions while maintaining the appearance of respecting the Queen's decision. But Louise had spent enough time reading her grandmother's private papers to understand that the Queen's choice had been deliberate, precisely because she wanted someone outside the established power structures to protect Credivar's unique character. The Queen had written extensively about her concerns that traditional estate management focused too heavily on profit maximization at the expense of conservation and community welfare. I appreciate the suggestion, Louise said carefully, but I think my grandmother wanted someone who would prioritize her vision over conventional management practices. That might require inexperience more than experience. Camilla's composure flickered slightly at the implicit criticism of conventional approaches. Louise, idealism is admirable in someone your age, but estates like this require practical management to survive. Your grandmother's vision won't matter if poor decisions lead to financial collapse or regulatory problems. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on everything from tax implications to staffing challenges, but the fundamental disagreement remained unbridgeable. Camilla believed that Louise was unprepared for the responsibilities she had inherited, while Louise increasingly understood that her grandmother had chosen her precisely because she wasn't part of the established system that the Queen had come to distrust. The visit ended cordially, but with both women understanding that their positions were incompatible. Camilla left convinced that Louise would eventually recognize her limitations and seek help from more experienced family members, while Louise felt strengthened in her determination to prove that youth and inexperience didn't necessarily disqualify someone from meaningful responsibility. The real test came 3 days later, when Louise discovered that Tom Parker Bowles had been quietly contacting estate suppliers and contractors, introducing himself as someone who would be involved in future management decisions at Craigivar. Several vendors had called the estate office asking for clarification about whether they should continue dealing with Louise directly or coordinate with Tom on major decisions. The presumption was breathtaking and revealed the family's strategy more clearly than any direct conversation had. Rather than waiting for Louise to recognize her limitations, Camilla's children were actively working to create a parallel management structure that would gradually assume control of estate operations. Louise's response surprised everyone, including herself. She called an emergency meeting with all estate department heads, introducing herself formally as the sole owner and decision-maker for Craigivar operations. She made it clear that no family members had authority to speak for the estate without her explicit approval, and that all future communications should go through her directly. "I know many of you have concerns about my age and experience," she told the assembled staff. "Those concerns are reasonable, and I share many of them. But I also know that my grandmother chose me for this responsibility, after watching me carefully for 20 years. I'm asking for your patience and support as I learn to fulfill her expectations." The response from estate staff was overwhelmingly positive. Many had served the Queen for decades and understood her character well enough to trust her judgment about Louise's potential. More importantly, they had already begun to see signs that Louise approached problems differently than traditional estate managers, showing more concern for employee welfare and environmental impact than profit optimization. Mrs. MacDonald, the estate manager, spoke for many of the staff when she said, "Lady Louise, your grandmother was the wisest person I ever knew, and she didn't make important decisions lightly. If she believed you could handle this responsibility, then we believe it too." The support from people who had actually worked with the Queen gave Louise confidence to take the next crucial step, hiring her own legal team to protect the estate from family pressure. She retained a Edinburgh law firm that specialized in Highland estate law, making it clear that any attempts to challenge her inheritance or circumvent her authority would be met with professional resistance. The message to the family was unmistakable. Louise might be young and inexperienced, but she wasn't naive or easily intimidated. The quiet granddaughter who had spent years avoiding conflict was discovering that some things were worth fighting for, and that her grandmother's final gift included the expectation that she would be strong enough to defend it. The confrontation that would define Louise's relationship with Camilla's family for years to come began with what seemed like a routine request. Laura Lopez had asked to visit Craigivar to collect some personal items that she claimed the Queen had promised to her children. Specifically, a collection of antique children's books that had been read to multiple generations of royal children, and a music box that had allegedly been earmarked for Laura's daughter. Louise, still trying to maintain family relationships despite growing tensions, had agreed to the visit without consulting the detailed inventory that the Queen's private secretary had prepared. It was a mistake that would teach her valuable lessons about the importance of documentation and the depths of family resentment that the inheritance had unleashed. Laura arrived with her husband Harry Lopes and their 3 children, presenting the visit as a sentimental journey to help the grandchildren understand their connection to their step-grandmother. The children, aged 8 to 14, had indeed spent time at Balmoral during family gatherings, and Louise initially saw no harm in allowing them to see the places where they had played during previous visits. But what began as a nostalgic tour quickly revealed itself as something more calculated. Laura had prepared her children with detailed stories about specific items throughout the castle, creating the impression that various paintings, ornaments, and pieces of furniture had been promised to them personally by the Queen. The children, innocent of any manipulation, spoke enthusiastically about the things their mother had told them they would inherit someday. "Granny Elizabeth said I could have the music box in her bedroom," Laura's youngest daughter announced confidently. "She showed me how it plays God Save the Queen when you wind it up." Louise found herself in an impossible position. Either she had to contradict a child's innocent beliefs about what her step-great-grandmother had promised, or she had to accept claims that weren't supported by any documentation she had discovered in the Queen's extensive personal records. The situation became more complex when Laura began photographing items throughout the castle, allegedly to help her children remember their visits, but actually creating a detailed catalog of valuable objects that she claimed had sentimental significance for her family. When Louise asked about the photographs, Laura's explanation was smooth and reasonable. "The children want to be able to show their friends pictures of where they spent time with Granny Elizabeth," Laura said. "You know how important it was to her that all the grandchildren felt connected to royal history." But Louise had been reading the Queen's private journals long enough to know that the late Queen had been extremely particular about which items went to which family members, and that she had never mentioned making promises to Camilla's grandchildren about specific inheritances. The Queen's careful documentation of every significant decision made Laura's claims seem increasingly questionable. The crisis erupted when Laura's middle son, encouraged by his mother, attempted to take the music box from the Queen's bedroom, claiming it had been promised to his sister. Louise gently but firmly prevented the removal, explaining that she needed to check her grandmother's records before allowing anything to leave the estate. Laura's reaction revealed the extent of her family's sense of entitlement. "Louise, these children have a relationship with items in this castle that goes back years. You can't simply decide that their memories and connections don't matter because you inherited the property." The argument escalated quickly, with Laura accusing Louise of being selfish and ungrateful, while Louise struggled to maintain her composure while protecting her grandmother's belongings. The confrontation was witnessed by castle staff, who later reported that they had never seen such behavior from guests during the Queen's lifetime. Lady Louise was trying to be reasonable and respectful, Mrs. MacDonald later told other staff members, but Mrs. Lopes was clearly expecting to take whatever she wanted without any oversight. It was quite shocking, really. The incident ended with Laura and her family leaving Craigievar in anger, but not before Laura made a threat that revealed the family's ultimate strategy. "Louise, you're making enemies of people who should be your allies. When you inevitably realize that you can't manage this responsibility alone, you'll need family support. Think carefully about whether alienating us is worth protecting a few sentimental objects." The confrontation forced Louise to confront uncomfortable truths about family dynamics that she had been trying to avoid. The visit hadn't been about helping children maintain connections to their step-great-grandmother. It had been an attempt to establish claims on valuable estate contents that could be leveraged into broader discussions about inheritance and ownership. Louise spent the following week conducting a comprehensive inventory of the castle's contents, working with estate staff who had served the Queen for decades and could provide accurate information about the provenance and significance of various items. What she discovered was both reassuring and disturbing. The Queen had indeed been extremely specific about which items should go to which family members after her death, but those designations bore no resemblance to the claims that Laura's family had made. The music box, for example, had been specifically mentioned in the Queen's private notes as something that should remain at Craigievar as part of the estate's historical collection, not as a gift to any individual. More troubling was the discovery that several valuable items, including a rare first-edition book of Scottish poetry and a small landscape painting by a 19th-century Highland artist, had disappeared from their usual locations sometime during Laura's visit. A thorough search of the castle failed to locate the missing pieces, strongly suggesting that they had been taken without permission. Louise faced a dilemma that tested both her principles and her judgment. Accusing Laura of theft would create a family scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation, but ignoring the apparent theft would set a precedent that could encourage further violations of the estate's integrity. Her decision to consult with her legal team rather than handle the matter within the family marked a crucial turning point in her approach to estate management. The Edinburgh solicitors advised her to document the missing items thoroughly and to inform palace security about the situation, creating an official record that could be used if future incidents occurred. The legal team also recommended implementing stricter protocols for all family visits to Craigievar, including supervised access to valuable collections and detailed documentation of any items that visitors claimed had been promised to them by the Queen. The suggestions felt extreme for family relationships, but the recent incident had demonstrated that informal trust was insufficient protection for the estate's valuable contents. When news of the missing items reached King Charles through palace security channels, his response revealed the impossible position that the inheritance had created for him. As monarch, he needed to maintain family harmony, but as the Queen's son, he was obligated to protect her legacy and wishes. "Louise, this situation is becoming untenable for everyone involved," he told her during a phone conversation that lasted nearly an hour. "I understand your desire to protect grandmother's belongings, but these kinds of accusations are exactly what I feared would happen when family members began fighting over inheritance matters." Louise's response surprised the king with its directness. "Your Majesty, I'm not fighting over inheritance matters. I'm protecting property that legally belongs to me and that grandmother specifically wanted preserved at Craigievar. If family members can't respect those boundaries, then the problem isn't with my management, it's with their expectations." The conversation revealed how much Louise had changed since receiving her inheritance. The uncertain young woman who had initially questioned her worthiness for such responsibility was developing into someone who could defend her grandmother's wishes even when doing so created family conflict. King Charles recognized the transformation but worried about its implications for family unity. "Louise, you're developing admirable strength, but you need to consider the broader consequences of your decisions. The monarchy depends on family cohesion, and these disputes are becoming public in ways that could damage all of us." Louise understood the king's concerns but had begun to see the situation from her grandmother's perspective. I think grandmother gave me this inheritance precisely because she knew that preserving her values might require someone willing to resist family pressure. Maybe family cohesion isn't as important as family integrity. The comment struck at the heart of the royal family's ongoing struggles with balancing personal relationships against institutional responsibilities. Louise was articulating a philosophy that prioritized principles over harmony, approach that had guided the queen throughout her reign, but that many family members found uncomfortable when applied to their own behavior. The missing items were never recovered, and Laura never acknowledged taking them. But the incident established a new dynamic in Louise's relationships with Camilla's family. They now understood that she wouldn't be pressured into compromising the estate's integrity for the sake of family peace, while she learned that their interest in Craigie-Avar extended far beyond sentimental connections to include financial calculations about valuable objects and potential future claims. The lesson was painful but necessary. Louise could honor her grandmother's memory and maintain family relationships, but only if family members were willing to respect the boundaries that came with her inheritance. Those who couldn't respect those boundaries would have to be treated as potential threats to the estate's welfare rather than trusted family members. The final confrontation came on a bitter February morning, exactly 1 year after the Queen's death, when Tom Parker Bowles arrived at Craigie-Avar with a proposal that he clearly believed Louise couldn't refuse. He brought with him a comprehensive business plan, prepared by a prestigious London consulting firm, complete with financial projections, marketing strategies, and organizational charts that reimagined the estate's future in ways that would maximize profitability while maintaining what he called. Louise received him in the Queen's former study, surrounded by her grandmother's journals and personal papers, a setting that she had chosen deliberately to remind herself of the values that the Queen had wanted preserved. Tom's presentation was polished and professional, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to proposing solutions to complex business problems. Louise, I've spent the past year watching you struggle with responsibilities that would challenge someone with decades of experience, he began, his tone carefully balanced between concern and condescension. You've shown admirable determination, but the reality is that Craigie-Avar's potential is being wasted under current management. This estate could be generating 3 times its current revenue while serving as a model for sustainable luxury tourism throughout the Highlands. The business plan was indeed impressive, outlining strategies for converting portions of the castle into exclusive guest suites, developing the hunting grounds for premium corporate retreats, and establishing partnerships with luxury travel companies that specialized in aristocratic experiences. The financial projections suggested that such changes could increase annual revenue from £2 million to over £6 million within 5 years. But as Louise read through the detailed proposals, she realized that Tom's vision would fundamentally transform everything that the Queen had valued about Craigie-Avar. The emphasis on profit maximization would require reducing staff, limiting conservation programs, and opening private spaces that the Queen had considered sacred to commercial exploitation. The Queen's bedroom would become the Princess Elizabeth suite, Tom explained enthusiastically, apparently oblivious to how disturbing Louise found the suggestion. Guests would pay premium rates to sleep where your grandmother spent her final summers. It's exactly the kind of authentic royal experience that wealthy tourists are seeking. Louise's response was quieter than Tom had expected, but its firmness surprised him. Tom, I appreciate the effort that went into this proposal, but it represents everything my grandmother was trying to protect Craigie-Avar from. She didn't give me this inheritance so I could turn her private sanctuary into a commercial enterprise. Tom's frustration finally broke through his professional demeanor. Louise, your grandmother is dead. She's not going to be disappointed if you make practical decisions about property that belongs to you now. What she would be disappointed by is watching you drive this estate into bankruptcy because you're too sentimental to make necessary changes. The suggestion that honoring the Queen's wishes was merely sentimentality struck Louise as deeply offensive, but it also revealed the fundamental difference in how she and Tom understood the inheritance. For him, the estate was an asset to be optimized. For her, it was a trust to be preserved. The estate isn't in financial trouble, Louise replied. We're meeting all our obligations while maintaining the conservation programs and community employment that my grandmother valued. Just because we're not maximizing profit doesn't mean we're failing. Tom's response revealed the depth of his family's resentment about the inheritance. Louise, you're 21 years old with no business experience, no understanding of Highland politics, and no appreciation for the complexities of managing a property this significant. The responsible thing would be to admit your limitations and bring in people who actually know what they're doing. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Tom alternating between reasonable arguments about estate optimization and increasingly direct challenges to Louise's competence and authority. He had clearly expected that a year of management challenges would have convinced her to seek help from more experienced family members, and her continued independence frustrated him beyond his ability to maintain diplomatic courtesy. The breaking point came when Tom suggested that Louise's attachment to her grandmother's vision was actually a form of emotional instability that made her unfit to manage the inheritance.
Your grandmother has been dead for a year, Louise.
At some point, you need to stop trying to have conversations with her through this estate and start making decisions based on current reality. Louise's response revealed how much she had changed during her year as estate owner. Tom, my grandmother spent 70 years learning how to balance tradition with change, how to preserve values while adapting to new circumstances. I'm not trying to have conversations with a dead woman. I'm trying to learn from a leader who understood something about long-term thinking that you clearly don't. The comment struck home because it was accurate. Tom's business plan focused entirely on short-term revenue maximization, without considering the environmental, social, or cultural costs of commercializing the estate. His proposals would generate impressive profits for several years, but would ultimately destroy the unique character that made Craigivar valuable. Tom's final argument revealed the extent of his family's sense of entitlement. Louise, this inheritance should have gone to people who understood its value and could protect it properly. Your grandmother made a mistake in her final years, and the responsible thing for you to do is correct that mistake by transferring management to people who can handle it. Louise's response was the strongest statement she had made since inheriting Craigivar. Tom, the only mistake my grandmother made was underestimating how much some family members would resent her decision to reward character over ambition. I'm not transferring anything to anyone. This estate belongs to me, and I'm going to manage it according to her vision, not yours. The conversation ended with Tom leaving in obvious anger, but Louise felt stronger and more confident than she had since receiving the inheritance. The repeated attempts to pressure her into surrendering control had forced her to articulate her own vision for the estate, and to develop the skills necessary to defend that vision against sophisticated opposition. 6 months later, Louise announced the establishment of the Queen Elizabeth Highland Conservation Trust, a charitable foundation that would use Craigivar as a headquarters for research into sustainable land management, wildlife conservation, and community-based rural development. The Trust's board included respected Scottish conservationists, Highland community leaders, and representatives from the University of Edinburgh's Environmental Studies program. The announcement generated positive coverage in environmental publications and Highland newspapers, establishing Louise as a serious voice in conservation circles rather than simply a young woman who had inherited valuable property. More importantly, it demonstrated that she had developed her own vision for fulfilling her grandmother's expectations while adapting to contemporary challenges. The royal family's response to the trust announcement revealed how completely the inheritance had reshaped family dynamics. King Charles issued a statement praising Louise's commitment to conservation and environmental stewardship, effectively endorsing her management approach despite ongoing pressure from other family members to intervene. Prince William and Catherine visited Craigivar to learn about the trust programs, bringing their children to see the conservation projects and educational facilities that Louise had developed. Their support carried particular weight because they represented the future of the monarchy, and their endorsement suggested that Louise's approach aligned with evolving royal values. But Camilla's family remained hostile, with Tom writing a guest column for The Spectator that criticized what he called amateur conservation efforts that prioritized idealism over practical results. He stopped short of naming Louise directly, but the context made his target clear to anyone following the family dynamics. Laura was more direct in her criticism, telling friends at social gatherings that Louise had wasted a magnificent inheritance on environmental nonsense that will bankrupt the estate within a decade. Such comments inevitably found their way back to Louise, reminding her that the family tensions created by the inheritance were far from resolved. But Louise had learned to measure success by standards other than family approval. The estate was financially stable, the conservation programs were attracting international attention, and the staff who had served her grandmother were thriving under management that prioritized their welfare alongside environmental protection. Most importantly, Louise had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed. The uncertain young woman who had questioned her worthiness for the inheritance had become someone who could defend her principles against sustained pressure, manage complex operations effectively, and articulate a vision for the future that honored the past while embracing change. The Queen's final gift to her granddaughter hadn't just been land and money. It had been an opportunity to discover her own strength and purpose. In giving Louise responsibility that forced her to grow beyond her previous limitations, the Queen had ensured that Craigievar would be protected by someone who understood that true conservation required not just preserving what existed, but nurturing the growth of what could be. The inheritance that had seemed like a burden had become a source of meaning and identity that Louise couldn't imagine living without. She had found her calling in the Highland mists, guided by her grandmother's wisdom and strengthened by opposition that had forced her to become worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. As she stood in the Queen's study 2 years after inheriting Craigievar, reading through conservation reports and planning documents for the trust's expansion, Louise understood that she had fulfilled her grandmother's most important expectation. She had proven that character could indeed triumph over circumstance, and that quiet determination could accomplish things that ambition and entitlement never could. The Queen's private estate had gone to Lady Louise not because she was ready for it, but because she was capable of becoming ready. And in rising to meet that challenge, Louise had discovered that her grandmother's final act of faith in her potential had been justified in ways that neither of them could have fully anticipated.